Frightened Galactic Council begs, don't let humans join this war. Part 1, the war nobody told us about. They held 17 emergency sessions before anyone thought to invite a human. That single fact told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. My name is Kale Morrow. I have been the Earth ambassador to the Galactic Council of Sovereign Worlds for 6 years. 6 years of being smiled at with too many teeth, handed the wrong-sized chair at every formal gathering, and assigned an office so far from the main chamber that I needed a transit pod just to attend meetings. 6 years of being the representative of a species that everyone in this station found either amusing or mildly embarrassing. I had grown used to it. I had stopped being angry about it. I had started bringing my own chair. Then one morning I walked onto the main concourse of Station Voriel and realized that every alien diplomat I passed was avoiding my eyes. That had never happened before. Usually they ignored me with confidence. Deliberate, comfortable, practiced indifference. This was different. A Thalvari official I had eaten lunch with dozens of times crossed to the other side of the corridor when she saw me coming. A Bellori trade representative who had once spent 40 minutes explaining why humans were too emotionally unstable for council membership gave me a look I had never seen on a Bellori face before. Something close to guilt. I stopped walking. I stood in the middle of that wide, pale corridor with its soft humming lights and its faint recycled air, and I asked myself a simple question. What do 17 emergency sessions, silent diplomats, and guilty expressions have in common? Something had gone wrong. Something large. And they had decided, as they always decided, that humanity did not need to know about it. I went back to my office and started pulling data. The public feeds were clean. Too clean. There was a particular kind of silence that council media produced when it was being managed, and I had learned to recognize it the way a sailor learns to recognize the color of a sky before a storm. Every major news relay was running routine content. Trade agreements. Cultural exchange summaries. A long, detailed piece about agricultural reform on Thalvari Prime. Nothing about fleet movements. Nothing about the outer cordon. Nothing about the 3 colony worlds in Sector 9 that had gone quiet 4 days ago. I almost missed that last part. It was buried in a standard shipping disruption notice. 3 waypoints in Sector 9 had stopped responding to automated routing signals. The notice attributed it to a relay malfunction. Routine. Unremarkable. Except that all 3 waypoints belonged to different species, on different planets, spread across 11 light-years of space. Relay malfunctions do not travel 11 light-years. I sent a request for an official briefing to the Council Secretariat. The automated system acknowledged it and assigned it a priority rating of 4, which meant it would be reviewed within 30 standard days. I sent a second request marked urgent. It was also assigned priority 4. I sent a third request directly to the Office of High Coordinator Vess, who was technically responsible for keeping member species informed of matters affecting galactic security. Her office replied within the hour to tell me that the High Coordinator was currently occupied with administrative matters and would respond at her earliest convenience. I had been a diplomat long enough to know what that meant. It meant never. So I did something I had not done in a long time. I walked to the residential wing of the station, found the quarters of a Bellori junior attaché named Oren, and knocked on his door. Oren was young by Bellori standards, which made him roughly equivalent to a human in his mid-30s, and he had made the mistake, early in his posting, of being genuinely curious about Earth. We had talked many times. He was one of the few beings on the station who asked me questions about humanity that were not loaded with condescension. He opened the door, saw me, and for a moment looked exactly like everyone else I had passed that morning. Then he stepped back and let me in. He did not want to talk. I could see that. He stood near the window with his 4 arms folded close to his body, which was what Bellori did when they were frightened, and he kept glancing at the door as if calculating how quickly he could reach it. I sat down without being invited and said, very calmly, that I had noticed the silence on the feeds, the empty shipping lanes in Sector 9, and the fact that 17 emergency sessions had been held without Earth receiving so much as a meeting summary. I told him I was not asking him to betray anyone. I was asking him to tell me what was happening, because whatever it was large enough to make every diplomat on this station forget how to look a human in the face. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said one word. Vreth. I knew the name. Every species in Council space knew the name. The Vreth Dominion was the oldest ongoing catastrophe in recorded galactic history. A hive fleet civilization, vast and ancient and utterly without interest in negotiation or coexistence. They moved through space in a slow, grinding wave, absorbing everything in their path. Planets. Civilizations. Entire star systems stripped clean and left silent. They had been doing it for 4,000 years. No one had ever stopped them. The Council had managed, for generations, to stay out of their path by seeding the outer cordon worlds one by one, quietly, without public announcement, calling it strategic repositioning and hoping the Vreth would be satisfied. They were not satisfied. They were never satisfied. That was the nature of them. Oren told me the Vreth had broken through the inner cordon boundary 3 weeks ago. Not probing. Not scouting. A full advance across 3 simultaneous vectors. The 3 colony worlds in Sector 9 were not experiencing a relay malfunction. They were gone. I sat with that for a moment. Gone. 3 worlds. Hundreds of thousands of lives, at minimum. Erased in 3 weeks while the Council held emergency sessions and filed shipping disruption notices and assigned my briefing requests a priority rating of 4. I asked Oren why they had not told us. Why Earth had been kept out of the sessions. Why, with the Vreth moving on Council space, humanity had not even been informed. He looked at me for a long time. Not the way he usually looked at me, with that open, careful curiosity. He looked at me the way you look at something you are not sure is safe to stand near. He said, very quietly, that telling humanity had been discussed. That it had been raised in the 2nd session, and again in the 6th, and again in the 14th. That every time it was raised, a majority of member species had voted against it. Not because they thought humanity couldn't help. Because they were afraid of what humanity would do. I thanked him. I left. I walked back through the pale corridor with its soft lights and its quiet, and I turned the thought over in my mind the whole way. They were not keeping us out because they thought we were weak. They were not keeping us out because they thought we were useless. They were keeping us out because they thought we were dangerous, and they would rather face the end of 3 worlds alone than let humanity through the door. I had almost reached my office when a hand closed gently around my arm. I turned to find Elder Sova of the Thalvari standing behind me, her pale gray face unreadable, her eyes very still. She was one of the oldest beings on the station. She had been a Council member longer than Earth had been in contact with alien civilizations. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, very softly, that she hoped I would not do anything rash. That she hoped, for the sake of everyone, that humanity would stay out of this. That there were things in motion that could not be controlled once they were started. I asked her what she was afraid of. The Vreth or us? She did not answer. She let go of my arm and walked away. I went into my office, sat down at my desk, and began to write a message. Not an official dispatch. Not a diplomatic communique. A personal message, to an old friend who worked in the Earth Defense Ministry. A man named Colin Fraser, who I had known since university, who was careful and steady and understood how to read between lines. I wrote, something is happening out here. I think you should know about it. I sent it and sat back and looked at the ceiling of my small, distant office and thought about 3 silent worlds and 17 closed sessions and the look on Elder Sova's face. They were afraid of us. I had spent 6 years being treated as a minor inconvenience. As a footnote. As the representative of a species that the galaxy had decided was best kept at a comfortable distance. And somewhere out there, the Vreth Dominion was moving, and the most powerful diplomatic body in known space was sitting in emergency session after emergency session, and the one thing they all agreed on was that whatever happened next, humanity must not find out. That, I thought, was going to be a problem. Not for us. For them. Part 2, what we look like from the outside. The Council's archive system was not difficult to access. That was the first surprising thing. I had spent years assuming that if humanity were ever the subject of classified Council documentation, it would be buried under layers of security protocols that would take months to navigate. What I found instead was a bureaucratic system so confident in human ignorance that it had not bothered to protect itself very well. The files were not hidden. They were simply filed under a category designation that translated, roughly, as managed contact species, which was a polite way of saying species the council had decided to observe rather than include. I found the first file on a Tuesday evening, alone in my office with a cold cup of coffee and the low hum of the station's ventilation system for company. It was a xenosociological assessment, commissioned 14 years ago by the Council's Department of Cultural Integration, authored by a Thalvari academic named Coordinator Wren. The title was dry and administrative. The contents were not. I read for 3 hours without moving. Wren had spent 11 years studying humanity through long-range observation, intercepted communications, and data gathered by Council monitoring stations that Earth had never been told existed. The report was meticulous, exhaustive, and deeply unsettling in a way that had nothing to do with hostility. Wren was not hostile. That was what made it so strange. The report was written with the careful, almost reverent tone of a scientist documenting something genuinely unprecedented, something that did not fit any existing category and therefore required an entirely new framework to understand. The first section was titled, Conflict Behavior. It opened with a line I read 3 times, "Humans do not treat war as a disruption to civilization. They treat it as an expression of it." Wren had catalogued human military history with the thoroughness of someone who found it both fascinating and alarming. What struck him most, he wrote, was not the scale of human violence, which was by galactic standards not particularly unusual, but the cultural architecture surrounding it. Humans named their weapons. They gave individual ships personalities. They wrote music about their conflicts and taught those songs to their children. They built monuments not only to victories but to defeats, to losses, to the individuals who had not come home. They processed war through art, through literature, through ceremony, through generations of transmitted memory. No other species in Council records did this, Wren noted. Most civilizations that had reached the level of organized armed conflict eventually developed mechanisms for minimizing its psychological presence, treating it as a necessary malfunction to be suppressed and forgotten. Humans did the opposite. They looked directly at the worst things they had done to each other and refused to look away. They turned suffering into narrative and narrative into identity. The practical consequence of this, Wren wrote with clear discomfort, was that humans carried their entire military history with them at all times, as a living, active inheritance. Every human soldier was, in some sense, fighting all of humanity's wars simultaneously. They carried the memory of every previous conflict as a source of information, of identity, and, most troublingly, of motivation. I sat with that for a while. I thought about the way I had grown up learning history. The way every school lesson about a past conflict had been framed not just as something that happened, but as something that mattered now. Something with lessons. Something with meaning. I had never thought of that as unusual. It was simply how history worked. Except apparently it was not how history worked for anyone else. The second section was titled, Adaptive Capacity. Wren had noted, with increasing unease as the section progressed, that humans had an unusual relationship with failure. Most advanced species, he wrote, developed military and strategic doctrines over long periods of institutional development, refining them slowly through study and limited application. These doctrines became stable, reliable, and deeply embedded in institutional culture. The downside was that they were slow to change. A strategy that stopped working might be relied upon for decades before the institution producing it accepted the need to revise it. Humans, Wren found, revised in real time. They argued during active operations. They modified tactics based on immediate results. They had developed a culture of what they called after-action review, in which every operation was immediately dissected, criticized, and used to generate new approaches, often within hours of its completion. The combination of this rapid iteration with their inherited willingness to absorb losses and continue meant that a human force engaged in conflict became progressively more effective the longer the conflict lasted. He wrote, against most known adversaries, time favors the defender or the more powerful party. Against humans, time is a liability. Every hour of engagement increases their capability. I read that line and felt something complex move through my chest. Not pride, exactly. Something older and harder than pride. The third section was the one that made me set down my coffee and stare at the wall for a full minute before continuing. It was titled, The Application Question, and it documented, in precise bureaucratic language, the Council's internal deliberations about whether to grant Earth full membership. I had always been told that humanity's application had been reviewed and deferred pending further cultural development assessments. That was the official position. I had believed it, more or less, in the vague way you believe things that are uncomfortable to question. The truth was that the application had been reviewed thoroughly. The Department of Cultural Integration had produced a full recommendation for provisional membership, contingent on a standard monitoring period. The Department of Interspecies Relations had supported it. The economics assessments had been favorable. Earth's technological progress had been assessed as within acceptable parameters. Then the member vote had been held. Not a public vote. A closed session, with no record distributed to human diplomatic staff. Of the 41 full-member civilizations, 27 had voted against human membership. Not because humans were underdeveloped. Not because Earth's technology was insufficient. The recorded objections, which Wren had somehow obtained and included in his report, made the reason very plain. The Bellori delegation had submitted a formal statement arguing that the inclusion of humanity would fundamentally destabilize council dynamics by introducing a species with demonstrated willingness to employ total commitment military engagement as a primary problem-solving tool. The Sorrenti had argued, more bluntly, that humanity was the only species in council space that had ever looked at an enemy with greater resources and greater numbers and decided this was a reason to work harder rather than negotiate a settlement. A smaller species called the Ven, whose homeworld was 3 systems from Earth's outer colonies, had submitted the most direct statement of all. It read, "We have reviewed human history carefully. We have reviewed their art, their literature, their recorded conflicts, and their documented responses to existential threat. Our assessment is that humanity does not have a threshold for acceptable loss in the defense of something they have decided to protect. We do not know what to do with a species like that. We do not think anyone does." 27 civilizations had looked at that assessment and voted to keep us out. I closed the file and sat in the quiet of my office and thought about that for a long time. Here is what I felt. I want to be honest about it, because it was not simple and I think simple feelings would have been easier to act on. I felt angry. Of course I felt angry. 6 years of being smiled past and talked over and assigned the wrong-sized chair and handed meeting summaries with sections redacted. 6 years of representing a species that the most powerful body in the galaxy had decided was best managed from a distance, like something hazardous. That anger was clean and familiar. But underneath the anger was something else. A strange, uncomfortable recognition. Because reading those files, reading the way those 27 civilizations had looked at humanity and seen something that frightened them, I had found myself thinking, they were not wrong. Not about everything. I thought about human history. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic narrative, but the real thing, which I had studied and which Wren had also studied, and which we had both arrived at the same place looking at. Humans were extraordinary at survival. We were extraordinary at adaptation. We were extraordinary at turning loss into fuel and setbacks into strategy. We had survived things that should have ended us, repeatedly, and come out of each survival changed in ways that made us harder to end the next time. That was a remarkable thing. It was also, I could see now with total clarity, a terrifying thing to observe from the outside. The Vreth had never encountered anything like us. That thought arrived quietly and sat down in my mind with enormous weight. 4,000 years of the Dominion moving through the galaxy, absorbing everything in its path, and it had never once encountered a species that looked at overwhelming force and started taking notes. 3 days later, the Solori lost their first colony world. The station's mood shifted in a way I could feel in the air, in the rhythm of footsteps in the corridors, in the conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms. The Solori were ancient. Gentle. They had been council members longer than most current civilizations had achieved space travel. They built beautiful things, made extraordinary music, and had not fought a war in 600 years. Watching their delegates after the news arrived was one of the harder things I had done in 6 years of diplomatic service. They moved through the station with a stunned stillness, like people who had believed themselves safe and had just discovered that safety was a story they had told themselves. I watched them. I thought about what Wren had written. And I sent Colin Fraser a second message. This one was longer. This one had numbers in it. Fleet positions, from what Oren had shared with me. The Vretha's advance vectors. The Council's current defensive posture, which was, in my honest assessment, insufficient. The timeline, based on publicly available data about the Vreth's historical rate of advance, for when they would reach the inner systems where Council member homeworlds were located. I ended the message with a single sentence. I think they are going to ask us for something soon, and I think you should have people ready to answer. I pressed send and went to the window and looked out at the stars. They were afraid of what we were. I had spent 6 years thinking that was an insult. I was beginning to understand it was something else entirely. Part 3, the Council begs. They called it an emergency session. The 18th one. I found out about it 40 minutes before it started because a junior Thalvari aide slipped a notification under my office door rather than sending it through the standard comm system. No explanation. Just the time, the chamber number, and a small handwritten note at the bottom that said, in careful standard, your attendance is requested. Not required. Requested. I put on my best jacket and walked to the main chamber for the first time in 6 years without being escorted, redirected, or politely informed that the session was members only. The chamber was vast and cold and arranged in the council's traditional tiered formation, 41 member delegations curved in a wide arc around a central floor. I had attended open sessions before, standing in the observer gallery above. I had never stood on the floor itself. My delegation's position, which had been assigned when Earth's provisional status was granted, was at the far left end of the lowest tier, in a section that other delegations had to lean forward and look past their neighbors to see. When I walked in, every face in that chamber turned toward me. All of them. Species that had perfected the art of ignoring human presence for decades, and every single one of them was looking directly at me. I walked to my seat. I sat down. I set my notes on the desk in front of me. I waited. High Coordinator Vess opened the session with a summary of the military situation that was, for the first time since this crisis had begun, completely honest. The Vreth advance had accelerated. 4 worlds were now confirmed lost. 2 more were under active assault with no realistic prospect of relief. The Council's combined defensive fleet, assembled over the previous weeks, had engaged a Vreth advance column in the Sector 9 corridor and been forced to withdraw. Losses had been significant. More significantly, the engagement had revealed that the Vreth had adapted their assault formation since their last known major engagement, which meant the tactical models the Council Military Command had been relying on were partially outdated. She paused. She looked at her notes. She said the Council had determined that the current strategic situation required a new approach. Then she said that the Earth delegation had been invited to attend this session because the Council wished to discuss potential contributions from humanity. Not membership. Contributions. I noticed several delegates shift in their seats at that word. I noticed that Orin, in the Pelori section, was looking at the ceiling. I noticed that Elder Sova, seated in the elevated Thalvari position 3 tiers up, had her eyes closed. A Belori delegate named Coordinator Farron, whose species had been among the most vocal opponents of human membership, spoke next. His tone was measured and precise in the way that people are measured and precise when they have rehearsed something many times. He said that the Council was aware of humanity's significant military manufacturing capacity. He said the Council was aware that human tactical doctrine offered approaches that differed meaningfully from standard Council military methodology. He said the Council was interested in exploring whether a technology and tactical knowledge exchange might be arranged, under Council oversight, to assist in the current defense effort. He did not say, "We want your weapons and your ideas." He said technology and tactical knowledge exchange. He did not say, "We want to use what you built without letting you near the situation." He said, "Under Council oversight." He waited. All 41 delegations waited. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the ventilation. I looked at Coordinator Farron for a long moment. Then I looked at my notes, though I did not need them. Then I stood up. I thanked the High Coordinator for the invitation. I said I was glad to finally be in the chamber. I said I had a few thoughts I hoped the Council would find useful. Then I said this. I said that 6 weeks ago, when the Vreth crossed the inner cordon, Earth had not been notified. I said that 3 colony worlds had been lost before humanity received any official communication about the threat. I said that the Council had held 17 emergency sessions on a crisis directly affecting galactic security, and the representative of 4 billion human beings had spent that time submitting briefing requests that were assigned priority 4. I said I wanted to be very clear that I was not raising this as a grievance. I was raising it as a context. Because the Council was now asking humanity to contribute to a defense that had been organized, planned, and partially executed without us. And I thought everyone in the chamber deserved to understand what that meant. I said, "You asked us to wait outside while you handled things. Now you are asking us to pass equipment through the door." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said that I had spent 6 years representing humanity to this Council. I had read the files. I knew what the Council's assessments of humanity concluded. I knew that 27 member civilizations had voted against human membership because they found humanity unpredictable, because they found our relationship with conflict unusual, because they did not know what to do with a species that looked at an overwhelming threat and started working harder. I said I understood that. I said I genuinely understood it. We are not an easy species to be neighbors with. I would not pretend otherwise. But I said this, the Council was not dealing with easy problems. The Vreth had been moving through this galaxy for 4,000 years. They had absorbed civilizations older and more sophisticated than anything currently sitting in this chamber. They had never slowed down. They had never negotiated. They had never been stopped. And the reason they had never been stopped was not because no one had tried. It was because every attempt to stop them had been made by species who, when the cost became high enough, recalculated their position. Who found the number at which survival meant stepping back. I said, we do not find that number. I said, I am not telling you that as a boast. I am telling you that as a fact. You have read our history. You know what we do when we decide something matters. You know that we do not stop mattering it. I said, the Solori lost a colony world. I watched their delegates after the news arrived. I want you to think about what it means that humanity, a species you have kept at arm's distance for 30 years, felt that loss. We did not have people on that world. We had no legal obligation, no treaty commitment, no political relationship with the Solori that would require us to care. We cared anyway. That is also in our file, if you read it carefully enough. I said, you are not asking us for a technology exchange. You know that is not what you are asking for. What you are asking for is help. Real help. The kind of help that does not come from a crate of equipment passed through a door. I said, I would like to know if this Council is willing to actually ask for that. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then Elder Sova opened her eyes. She stood slowly, which was a significant gesture for a Thalvari of her age, and she looked at me across the tiers of the chamber, and she said the words that no Council member had ever said to a human representative in the history of Earth's provisional status. She said, we are afraid. She said it simply, without apology, without qualification. She said, we have been afraid of the Vreth for generations, and we have managed that fear by moving out of their path, and now there is nowhere left to move, and we are still afraid. And we have also, she said, been afraid of humanity, for reasons you have now read in our files, and we have managed that fear by keeping you at a careful distance, and that distance has cost us, and we know it. She said, what the ambassador has described, this quality of not finding the number, we have seen it in your history and it has frightened us because we did not know what it would mean if it were aimed at something other than yourselves. We did not know what humans looked like when they were protecting someone else. She said, we would like to find out. If you are willing. I stood there for a moment. 41 civilizations, and the oldest voice among them, asking a human if he was willing. I thought about 3 gone worlds. I thought about the Solori delegates walking through the station with that stunned stillness. I thought about 4,000 years of the Vreth moving through the galaxy because nothing had ever made them stop. I said, yes. With conditions. There was a brief negotiation. It lasted 4 hours. The conditions were not complex. Full membership vote within 90 days of the conflict's conclusion. Complete intelligence sharing, effective immediately. Human military command authority over joint operations in any sector where human forces were deployed. No oversight committees, no approval delays, no technology exchange frameworks with 12 layers of administrative review. There was resistance. Of course there was resistance. The Belori delegation argued for an hour and a half. The Sorrenti raised 7 procedural objections. 3 smaller species requested additional consultation time. Then another report came in from the front. A 5th world. The resistance stopped. I come to Earth at the end of the session. Not Colin in the Defense Ministry this time. The official channel. The full diplomatic protocol, Priority 1, high encryption. The reply came back in 4 hours and 12 minutes. No lengthy response, no committee review, no administrative assessment. A deployment manifest. 17 fleet groups. Full logistics chain. Command personnel list. The Council's liaison officer who was sitting next to me when the reply came in looked at the manifest for a long moment. He said, "This was prepared in advance." I said, "Yes." He said, "How long ago?" I thought about the message I had sent Colin the first evening, when the feeds were too quiet and Oren had said one word to me in a whispered room. I said, "A little while ago." He looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize. That complicated mix of relief and alarm. The look that said, "We were right to be afraid, and we are very glad you are here, and we are still not entirely sure what we have just agreed to." I understood that look. I did not blame them for it. I simply picked up my notes and walked out of the chamber and started making calls. The Vreth had been moving through this galaxy for 4,000 years and nothing had ever made them stop. I was looking forward to the introduction. Part 4, What Humans Brought to a War. The first human fleet came out of transit 16 days after the council session. I was on the observation deck of Station Voriel when it happened, standing next to a Balori military analyst named Coordinator Davin, who had been assigned as my liaison to the Joint Command structure. Davin was precise, professional, and had spent his career studying military systems. He had never seen a human vessel up close. I watched his face when the transit signatures resolved. The ships did not look elegant. That was the first thing. Council warships tended toward smooth lines and minimal external structure, efficient geometries that moved through space with a kind of refined quietness. Human vessels looked like they had been designed by someone who had decided that a warship's job was to take as much damage as possible and stay functional long enough to be unpleasant about it. They were dense, heavily armored, almost aggressively structural, with external reinforcement that served no aesthetic purpose and every practical one. They were also loud on every sensor band, broadcasting with a confidence that said, "We are here, we know you can see us, and we do not particularly mind." Davin looked at the formation for a long time. He said, "They are not arranged in a standard defensive spread." I said, "No." He said, "The lead elements are positioned for immediate offensive action." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "There are so many of them. 17 fleet groups. Not 17 ships. 17 fleet groups, each one a self-contained operational system with its own logistics chain, repair capacity, medical infrastructure, and command hierarchy. Earth had sent the kind of force that was not assembled in response to a problem. It was the kind of force that was assembled in anticipation of one. The Council Military Command had been expecting, I think, something roughly equivalent to what they had already deployed. A comparable force, using comparable methods. What they got instead was something that immediately started doing things differently. The first difference became apparent within 6 hours. Human command staff arrived at the Joint Operations Center, reviewed the existing tactical framework, and very politely began to take it apart. They were not dismissive about it. Captain Nora Ashton, who commanded the lead fleet group and served as senior military liaison, sat with the Council's chief tactical officers for 3 hours and asked questions. Detailed questions. The kind of questions that required the person being asked to explain not just what they were doing, but why they had decided to do it that way, and whether they had considered alternatives, and what had happened the last time a different approach had been tried. Council tactical officers were not accustomed to being questioned like that. They were accustomed to a command culture that valued institutional doctrine and treated deviation from it as a sign of inexperience. Watching them in that meeting was genuinely uncomfortable. Several of them became defensive. One Sorrenti admiral left the room twice claiming administrative obligations. Ashton was patient throughout. She took careful notes. She thanked everyone for their time. Then she went back to her command group and within 4 hours had produced a revised operational framework that looked, to Council eyes, almost shockingly different from anything they had been working with. Davin brought the framework to me. He spread it on my desk and looked at it as if trying to determine whether it was a tactical plan or evidence of some kind of disorder. He said, they have divided the front into 6 priority zones and assigned different resource allocation rules to each one based on something they are calling response value. What is response value? I said, it is a calculation of how much military effect you get for a given investment of force in a particular location. They assign more resources to places where the return on that investment is highest, and less to places where it is not, and they adjust the calculation continuously based on what is happening. He said, but that means they will sometimes deliberately not defend something that is being attacked. I said, yes. If defending it would cost more than it is worth strategically. He was quiet. Then he said, the Council does not do that. We defend everything we commit to defending. I said, I know. He said, species lose faith if they feel they are not being protected. I said, I understand that. Ashton's framework accounts for it. The calculation includes political cost. It is not just about military efficiency. It is about what a given action does to the overall situation, including how member species respond to it. He looked at the framework again. He said, this is very complicated. I said, yes. They like complicated. Complicated means there are more variables, and more variables means more opportunities to find advantages the other side has not noticed. The first joint engagement happened 9 days later, in the Sector 7 corridor, where a Vreth advance column had pushed through a defensive line and was moving toward a Pelori population center. The Council's assessment was that the column was too large to intercept with available forces without unacceptable losses. The recommendation had been to conduct a managed withdrawal and prepare a secondary defensive position. Ashton reviewed the assessment, asked 4 questions, and proposed something different. She proposed hitting the column from 3 directions simultaneously, using a force configuration that the Council's tactical models classified as insufficient for the engagement. When the Sorrenti admiral objected that the numbers did not support a successful outcome, Ashton looked at him for a moment and then said, very calmly, that she was not planning for a successful outcome in the first engagement. She was planning for a successful outcome in the second and third engagements, which the first engagement would create the conditions for. The admiral asked what she meant. She said, we are going to hurt them. Not stop them. Hurt them, make them reconfigure their advance formation to account for the attack, and use that reconfiguration to identify the gaps in their logistics chain. Then we are going to hit those gaps. She said, the Vreth have never fought an enemy that was willing to take losses in a suboptimal engagement in order to create a better engagement later. We are going to use that. The admiral said, you are planning to lose on purpose. Ashton said, I am planning to learn on purpose. There is a difference. I was not in the operations center during the engagement. I was on the station, watching the real-time data feed with Davin beside me. What I saw was not easy to watch. Human ships moved into contact with a Vreth column that outmassed them significantly, and they fought hard, and they took losses, and they did not break and they did not withdraw. They absorbed the Vreth's response patterns, fed the data back to the command group, and then, 40 minutes into the engagement, a second human force came in from a direction the Vreth had left exposed precisely because the first engagement had drawn their attention. The logistics strike was precise. 3 Vreth command and coordination nodes, identified from the behavioral data the first force had collected at cost, hit within 90 seconds of each other. The column did not collapse. The Vreth did not break. But they stopped advancing. They pulled back to assess. And in the space that created, the Pelori population center completed its evacuation. Davin sat down very slowly. He said, they planned to be hit. They planned for their ships to absorb that, and they used the information from being hit to find the weak points. I said, yes. He said, how did the commanders of those first ships agree to that? I thought about how to explain it. I said, they understood what it was for. Humans can accept very difficult things if they understand the purpose. If the purpose is clear and the cause is worth it, the willingness is there. He said, and they trusted that Ashton was telling them the truth about the purpose. I said, command trust works differently for us. It is not automatic and it is not simply hierarchical. It is earned. Ashton has earned it. They went in because they believed she had a plan and it would matter. He was quiet for a while. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, we have never had that. In council military culture, you follow orders because the institution requires it. You do not have to believe in the plan. You just have to execute it. He said, I think that is why we keep fighting the same way even when it stops working. Over the following 3 weeks, the pattern repeated and deepened. Human forces fought, learned, adjusted, and fought differently. They were not winning every engagement. The Vreth were ancient and vast and they did not break easily. But something was happening that Davin began tracking on a secondary monitor he kept running in the corner of his workspace at all times. The Vreth were slowing down. Not stopping. Not breaking. Just, for the first time in 4,000 years of recorded history, not moving at their standard rate. The advance that had been grinding forward with mechanical consistency, absorbing everything in its path without deviation, was developing gaps, hesitations, repositions. Council intelligence intercepted a Vreth coordination signal during the 4th week. It was not a language anyone had successfully translated in detail, but the tactical analysis team had developed enough context to interpret general intent. The signal was a query. It was being sent back through the Vreth command chain, from the advance elements to the deeper command structure. The query, as best as anyone could translate it, was 3 words. What is this? I was in Ashton's operations briefing when the translation came through. She read it once. Then she set it down and picked up her next briefing document as if it were simply the next item on the agenda. One of her lieutenants, a young officer named Pete Hollis who had been running logistics for the 2nd Fleet Group, looked at the translation and then looked at Ashton and said, "They do not know what we are." Ashton said, "No." Hollis said, "Should we be concerned that they are asking?" Ashton considered this for exactly 2 seconds. She said, "No. Concern is what you feel when you do not know what to do next. We know what to do next." She turned back to the briefing. Around the table, 12 human officers turned with her. Davin, standing beside me near the door, said nothing. But I saw him write something on his notes. I did not ask what it was until later, when the briefing had ended and we were walking back through the corridor. He had written, "I begin to understand why they kept you outside." He looked at me when I read it. He said, "It is not an insult." I said, "I know." He said, "It is that we did not know, until now, what you looked like when you were fighting for something instead of against something. It changes the shape of it." I said, "Does it change it in a useful direction?" He paused at the corridor junction. He said, "Yes. I think it does. I think that is the most frightening part." Part 5, What it costs, and what it means. The war ended on a Thursday. I know that sounds wrong. Wars are supposed to end with ceremonies, with formal declarations, with official moments that history can point to. And there was eventually a ceremony. But the real end happened on a Thursday, at approximately 0340 station time, when a coordinated strike by 4 human fleet groups severed the Vreth Dominion's primary logistics spine across a front 6 light-years wide, and the advance, which had been moving for 4,000 years without pause, simply stopped. Not retreated. Stopped. Like a mechanism that had run out of something it needed. I was awake when it happened. I had not been sleeping well for weeks. I was sitting at my desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold, reading the overnight intelligence summaries, when the alert came through. I read it twice. Then I walked to the window and stood there looking at the stars for a long time. Nora Ashton had briefed me on the operation 4 days before it launched. She had laid out the strike plan on my conference table and walked me through each phase with the same clear, methodical calm she brought to everything. The operation required precise timing across multiple fleet groups operating in different sectors, with limited communication windows and no room for adjustment once the first strike initiated. If any element failed, the others would be exposed. If the timing slipped, the opportunity would close. I had asked her what the expected losses were. She had looked at her notes and given me a number. I had sat with that number for 4 days. I did not ask her to revise the plan. I did not suggest alternatives. She had people more qualified than me to do that, and they had already done it, and the number was the number. But I had sat with it, because that is what you do when you are the person who set this in motion. You sit with the weight of what you asked for. The strike launched at 0200. By 0340, it was done. The losses were exactly as projected. Not more. Not fewer. Exactly as projected, which meant that the planning had been right, and the execution had matched the planning, and the people who had not come back had gone in knowing what they were part of and had done it anyway. I thought about what I had told Davin. That humans can accept very difficult things if they understand the purpose. I sat in my office until the sun simulation lighting on the station shifted to morning cycle. Then I washed my face, put on my jacket, and went to work. The days that followed were complicated in the way that only the aftermath of something large can be complicated. The Vreth did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They simply stopped, regrouped, and withdrew to the far side of the outer cordon, which was either a tactical repositioning or the beginning of a longer reconsideration. Council intelligence assessed the latter with moderate confidence. The strike had not destroyed the Vreth Dominion. It had, for the first time in recorded history, made the cost of continued advance exceed whatever the Dominion's internal calculation of acceptable cost was. 4,000 years. And all it had ever taken was something that made the math change. The Council held a formal session 8 days after the strike. It was the first session that felt different from every other session I had attended, because for the first time, I did not feel the particular quality of careful tolerance that had characterized every previous interaction between human diplomatic staff and the Council's institutional machinery. Something had shifted. Not warmth, exactly. Not acceptance in any simple sense. But a different quality of attention. The kind of attention you give to something you have finally decided to see clearly. High Coordinator Vess opened by formally acknowledging the contribution of human forces to the joint defense operation. She read a prepared statement that was careful and measured and diplomatically precise. I listened to it politely. Then I stood up and tabled the motion. Full human membership in the Galactic Council of Sovereign Worlds. Not provisional status. Not monitored integration. Full membership, with all associated rights, responsibilities, and council voting privileges, effective within 90 days. The room did not erupt. These were diplomats. They expressed alarm through the careful arrangement of their posture and the precise calibration of their silence. The Bellori delegation requested a procedural review period. I reminded them that the Joint Defense Agreement included a clause, negotiated in the original 4-hour session, committing the Council to a membership vote within 90 days of the conflict's conclusion. I had written that clause myself. I had made sure it was in the agreement. I had also made sure the language was unambiguous, which meant the procedural review request had no grounds. Coordinator Farron, who had led the Bellori opposition in the original session, looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. He said, "You prepared for this?" I said, "I prepared for a lot of things." He said, "You prepared for the contingency in which we attempted to delay the membership question after the military situation was resolved." I said, "I prepared for several contingencies. That was one of them." He was quiet. Then he said, not with hostility but with something that sounded, genuinely, like respect, "You are very thorough." I said, "It is a species trait." The debate lasted 6 hours. Not because the legal question was unclear. It was clear. The agreement was binding and the vote had to happen. The debate lasted 6 hours because 41 civilizations needed to say out loud, in a formal setting, the things they had been carrying privately, and that process takes as long as it takes. Some of what was said was difficult to hear. A Sorrenti delegate gave a speech about the risks of admitting a species whose relationship with organized violence was, in his view, not sufficiently evolved. He was not cruel about it. He was genuinely worried. I listened to the whole speech and then responded by pointing out that the species whose relationship with organized violence he was describing had just demonstrated that relationship on behalf of 20 civilizations, at significant cost to itself, in response to a request from the very institution that had spent 30 years refusing to include it. He did not have a strong reply to that. Other things were said that were harder in a different way. The Bellori delegation, Orin among them, gave a statement acknowledging that their earlier opposition to human membership had been rooted in genuine fear and that fear, they now believed, had made them less safe, not more. Watching Orin's face while his senior delegate read that statement, I thought about our first conversation in his quarters, and the way he had looked at me like something he was not sure was safe to stand near. He caught me looking at him. He gave me a small gesture that I had learned, over years of lunches and conversations, was the Bellori equivalent of a rueful smile. The vote was held at the end of the 6th hour. 26 in favor. 11 against. 4 abstentions. It was not unanimous. I want to be clear about that. 11 civilizations voted against, and they had their reasons, and some of those reasons were not entirely wrong. Humanity is not simple. Humanity is not easy. The things that made us capable of what we had just done were the same things that had made those 27 civilizations vote against us 30 years ago, and those things had not changed. They would not change. We were what we were. But 26 civilizations had decided that what we were was worth having in the room. I called Earth that evening. The official channel, full diplomatic protocol, the entire formal structure. And when the connection opened and I saw the faces of the people on the other end, I said the words I had spent 6 years working toward. I said, it passed. The reaction was not dramatic. These were government officials and ministry staff who had been through a war. They looked tired and relieved in the quiet way of people who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down. Someone asked about the losses. I gave them the number. There was a silence. Then someone said, "We will take care of that." They meant the families, the records, the full accounting that humanity insisted on performing for its own dead. We had a ceremony for that. We had several ceremonies for that. This was one of the things that had frightened other species about us, the way we looked at our losses and counted them and named them and carried them forward. We were going to do all of that. I told them we would talk about the full transition process in the morning. Then I ended the call and went to the observation deck and stood at the window for a while. Elder Sova found me there about an hour later. She moved quietly for someone of her age, and I did not hear her coming. She stood beside me and we both looked at the stars for a while without speaking. She said, "I owe you an apology. For the corridor, in the beginning. What I said to you." I said, "You asked me to keep my people out of the war." She said, "Yes. I was afraid of what would happen if you came in." I said, "Were you wrong to be afraid?" She considered this seriously, in the way the Thalvari considered everything, with a deliberateness that felt like respect for the question. She said, "I was wrong about what I was afraid of. I was afraid of what humanity would do to the war. I was not thinking about what humanity would do for it." I said, "There is not always a clear line between those two things." She said, "No. I know that now. I think I did not know it before." We stood together for a while longer. Then a young Solori diplomat appeared at the edge of the observation deck. She was from the colony world that had survived, the one whose evacuation had been completed in the gap created by Ashton's first costly engagement. She was very young by Solori standards and she moved with the careful, slightly stunned quality of someone who had been through something they had not expected to survive. She had been assigned to the Council's new Human Liaison Working Group, which had been established during the transition process. She had introduced herself to me 3 days ago and asked, with genuine and serious curiosity, whether she could ask me questions about humanity when time permitted. I had said yes. She came to stand on my other side, looking out at the same stars, and after a moment she said, "I have been reading your history. As part of the liaison preparation." I said, "And?" She said, "It is very long." I said, "Yes." She said, "And very complicated." I said, "Also yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I read about a battle that happened on your world, a very long time ago, before you had reached space. There was a city, and it was surrounded on all sides, and the people inside it were outnumbered and outmatched, and by every military analysis the city should have fallen within days. But it held for months. Many people inside did not survive. But the city held." She said, "I could not understand, when I read it, what made them hold. It was not logical. The logical thing, by the standards of most species, would have been to surrender and minimize losses." She said, "I think I understand it a little better now. After watching what happened in Sector 7. After watching how your people fight." I asked her what she understood. She thought about it carefully. She said, "I think humans decide, about certain things, that the thing itself is worth more than the cost of keeping it. And once you decide that, the calculation is not about cost anymore. It is just about the thing." I looked at her. She was very young and she had lost a world and she was standing here trying to understand the species that had helped her keep everything else. I said, That is a very good way to put it. She said, will you always be like that? I thought about it honestly. I thought about 4,000 years of the breath moving through the galaxy and not stopping, and one Thursday morning when they stopped. I thought about 6 years of being assigned the wrong size chair, and the vote at the end of 6 hours, 26 in favor. I thought about Nora Ashton reading a number out of her briefing notes with complete calm. I thought about the names of the people who had not come home. I said, probably. That is a fairly deep aspect of what we are. She said, is that something we should be afraid of? I said, I think you should understand it. Understanding it is better than being afraid of it. She looked at the stars. She said, I think you are right. I think perhaps many of us were afraid of things we had not tried to understand, and we made decisions from that fear, and those decisions cost us things we did not have to lose. I said, yes. And we made our own decisions from our own frustrations, and some of those were not perfect either. We are not a simple species. I will not pretend we are. She said, no. But you are here. And the Solori homeworld is still here. And the Pelori Population Center is still here. And the Council is still here. She said, I think that is worth quite a lot. I said, I think so too. We stood at the window together for a while, the three of us, a human diplomat and a Thalvari elder and a young Solori on her first posting, looking out at a galaxy that was, on balance, a little more intact than it had been 3 months ago. It was not a perfect ending. There were 11 civilizations that had voted against us, and we would need to build those relationships carefully and honestly over time. There were losses that needed to be properly honored. There was a Vreth dominion that had not been destroyed, only stopped, and that would require sustained attention for years to come. There was an enormous amount of work ahead. But the stars were there, and we were there, and humanity had a seat at the table, which was where we should have been 30 years ago. I had one last thought, standing at that window. It was not a diplomatic thought. It was not a strategic thought. It was a simple, human thought, the kind that arrives quietly when the work is done and you finally have a moment to feel it. I thought, we were worth being afraid of. And we were also worth being grateful for. And the best version of humanity was always the one where those two things were understood together, not as a contradiction, but as two sides of the same truth. We were strong. We were stubborn. We looked at things that frightened other species and we stayed. We paid costs that other species recalculated away from. We named our dead and carried them with us and went back. And we did it because we decided that some things were worth it. Not because we were told to. Not because an institution required it. Because we looked at something that mattered and we decided, collectively, stubbornly, in that particular way of ours, that it was going to keep mattering. They called us frightening. They were not wrong. But the universe is full of frightening things. We are the only ones that chose to be frightening for someone. That, I thought,